There is a letter sitting in an old archive that almost no one notices. It is thin, yellowed by time, and filed between hundreds of forgotten documents. Most researchers walk right past it, but the few who stop and actually read it don't forget what it says. The letter was written in October 1901 by a school teacher named Edna Morse. She had been teaching for nearly 2 decades, long enough to see generations of children pass through her classroom, long enough to remember how things used to be. And in that letter she makes a quiet but dangerous decision. She refuses to follow the new curriculum, not because she is rebellious, not because she wants attention, but because something has changed, and she knows it. She writes carefully, choosing every word like someone who understands the risk. She explains that she will continue teaching what she always taught, the same lessons that had been considered normal for years, lessons about how money is created, who benefits when systems change, and why some people grow rich while others fall behind. These were not theories, they were standard classroom material, until suddenly they weren't. No public announcement, no national debate, just silence. Across the country the same shift begins to happen. Teachers receive new instructions, new books, new guidelines. Everything looks official, organized, even impressive, but something is missing. Entire sections of economic history are gone, discussions about land ownership gone, explanations of how financial systems affect ordinary people gone, even well-known ideas that had shaped a generation quietly disappear. And most people never question it because on the surface everything seems like progress, more structure, more efficiency, more control. But beneath that surface something else is happening. To understand it, you have to go back years earlier, to a time when a single book spread across the country like wildfire. It was read in homes, debated in churches, taught in schools. It asked a simple question: if society is becoming richer, why are so many people still struggling? The answer it gave was unsettling. It pointed toward land ownership and a system that allowed wealth to gather in the hands of a few without them producing anything at all. The idea was powerful, too powerful, because if people understood it they might start asking questions, and if enough people asked questions the system itself could be challenged. So over time quiet changes began, not loud enough to cause panic, not obvious enough to create resistance, just enough to reshape what the next generation would learn. By 1901 those changes were no longer small, they were organized. Well-funded groups began influencing education, offering support, resources, and new frameworks. Everything was presented as improvement, but hidden inside those improvements was a careful removal of ideas that once defined how people understood the world. Edna Morse saw it happening. She compared the old lessons with the new ones line by line, and she realized something chilling. This was not just an update, it was a replacement, a quiet rewriting of what children would believe about money, power, and history. So she made a choice. She would keep teaching the old lessons, even if she was told to stop, even if it cost her job, because once knowledge disappears from the classroom it does not come back easily, and once a generation grows up without it they may never realize what was taken from them. Her letter ends without drama, no anger, no fear, just a calm statement of intent. But that calmness is what makes it unsettling, because it feels like a warning, not just for her time but for anyone willing to listen. And the strangest part, there is no clear record of what happened to her after that letter was sent. No follow-up, no official response, no conclusion, just silence, like the story itself was meant to fade away. And maybe it almost did, because that letter is still sitting there, unread, unnoticed, waiting. And the question it leaves behind is impossible to ignore. If something this important could be erased once, how much else has already been quietly removed without anyone realizing it? The deeper you go into those old records, the stranger the pattern becomes. At first it looks like normal change, like education simply evolving with time, but then you start noticing what was removed, not just what was added. Entire movements that once shaped the country begin to fade from the story. There was a time when people openly argued that money should be controlled by the government, not private banks. It was not a fringe idea, it was powerful enough to win elections, strong enough to send real leaders into office. Across multiple states farmers supported it, workers believed in it, entire communities built their hopes around it. And then suddenly it was labeled as foolish, outdated, something not worth discussing anymore. No long explanation, no public debate, just a quiet shift in how it was described. The same thing happened to the farmers who once stood up against railroad monopolies. They had fought back against unfair pricing, they had organized across the plains, and their efforts were strong enough to force new laws into existence. For a moment they changed the system, but in the new version of history their fight becomes a small detail, barely mentioned, easy to ignore. Even the policies that shaped rural life, the laws that made it harder for farmers to get credit, the decisions that pushed families into losing their land, those stories begin to disappear completely, and something even more unsettling replaces them, a cleaner version of history, one that talks about hard work, about personal responsibility, about market solving, everything on their own. It sounds reasonable, even comforting, but it leaves out the most important part. It never explains who sets the rules, who benefits from those rules, or what happens when people have no power to push back. It gives answers but removes the questions that once challenged those answers. Edna Morse saw this clearly. She was not just teaching facts, she was teaching her students how to think, how to look at history and ask who gained from this decision, who lost, and why. She believed that every policy had a winner, and understanding that was the key to understanding everything else. But the new system did not want students asking those questions. It wanted them to accept conclusions without seeing the path that led there. In her classroom, Edna continued the old way. She showed her students real events, real cause and effect, real consequences. She did not protect them from uncomfortable truths. She believed it was her duty to prepare them for reality, not hide it, and for that she paid the price. Only a few months after writing her letter, she was removed from her position. No public explanation, no scandal, just a quiet ending like so many others. But while her story was fading, something much bigger was rising. Powerful men began investing heavily in education. They offered funding, resources, structure. They promised to modernize schools to prepare children for a new industrial world, and on the surface they succeeded. Schools became more organized, more uniform, more controlled, but that control came with conditions. Institutions that accepted financial support also accepted new standards, new ways of teaching, new limits on what could be included. Teachers who followed the system were rewarded. Those who resisted slowly disappeared. It did not require secret meetings or hidden plans. It was simpler than that. The same people who benefited from the system were now shaping what the next generation would learn about it. They did not need to silence anyone directly. They only needed to decide what was worth teaching and what was not. Back in Kansas, in the cold winter of 1901, a classroom stood quietly in defiance of that shift, a single teacher holding onto ideas that were already being erased. But classrooms like hers did not last. One by one they changed, or they vanished, and with them an entire way of understanding the world began to slip away, until what remained felt complete, even though something essential was missing. And that is what makes this story unsettling, not because something false replaced the truth, but because the truth was slowly trimmed down until it no longer threatened anyone, until it no longer raised dangerous questions. And the most chilling part, most people never realized it happened because they were never taught to notice. And once that kind of change takes hold, it does not just rewrite the past, it quietly controls the future. And if you look closely enough, you can still see the moment it all began, hidden in forgotten classrooms, buried in quiet letters, and erased from the lessons that followed. Because what disappeared was not just information, it was the ability to question the system itself. And once that is gone, what remains is something far more powerful than silence. It is belief without understanding, and that is where the real story begins. Edna Morse did not just teach lessons, she knew the lives behind those lessons. Every child sitting in her classroom came from a story, a real one, not something written in a book. She had watched their parents struggle, watched fields that once fed families slowly slip away, land that took years of hard work to build gone in what felt like a moment. One bad season, one policy change, one decision made far away, and suddenly everything collapsed. She saw it happen again and again. Farms lost, homes emptied, families broken. And what disturbed her most was not just the loss, it was how clearly it followed a pattern she understood because she had studied the history, not the simplified version, but the real one, the kind that shows cause and effect, the kind that reveals who gains and who pays the price. She knew these outcomes were not random, they were built step by decisions made by real people with names, with power, with interests. And she understood something even more dangerous. If her students never learned that pattern, they would grow up blind to it. They would see loss and believe it was their fault. They would see wealth and believe it was earned fairly every time. They would never ask who shaped the system or why the same results kept repeating. They would accept the story given to them, that the market is natural, that outcomes are deserved, that failure is personal. And once they believed that, they would stop questioning anything at all. That is what she refused to allow. She was not teaching rebellion, she was teaching awareness. She was showing her students how to look deeper, how to trace decisions back to their source, how to understand that every system has architects. Her lessons were not based on opinion, they were built on records, documents, evidence, the same standards she used for everything else. And that is exactly why it became a problem, because evidence leads to questions, and questions lead to uncomfortable truths. Years later, some of her students would remember her not as a loud or dramatic teacher, but as someone who made the world feel understandable, not simple, not easy, but something that could be figured out. They remembered how she treated every subject the same way. Look at the facts, follow the trail, find who benefits, one of them wrote. that she was the only teacher who made him feel like nothing was random, that everything had a reason if you were willing to search for it. After she was gone, that feeling disappeared. The new lessons were smooth, easy to follow, but empty in a strange way, kind but lacking depth, and the students felt it even if they could not explain it. Time moved forward. Those same students grew up. They lived through financial crises, through sudden collapses, through decisions that shaped entire generations. Some of them may have recognized the patterns, some may not have, and the difference between those two groups came down to one thing: whether they had learned to question before the door was closed. Meanwhile, the system continued to evolve. Education became more structured, more controlled, more predictable. It produced people who could read, write, and follow instructions, but fewer who would stop and ask why those instructions existed. And that change was not accidental. The goal was never chaos, it was stability, a population that could function smoothly without friction, without resistance. But stability comes at a cost, because when people stop asking questions, they also stop seeing the forces shaping their lives. The old lessons did not disappear completely. They survived in small places, in memories, in forgotten letters, in dusty archives, waiting because teachers like Edna Morse did what teachers always do: they wrote things down. They left behind traces, and those traces still exist, hidden in files that no one has opened for decades, buried in collections that stretch across states and cities. Millions of documents, each one holding a piece of a story that was never meant to last, but it did. And that raises a question that is hard to ignore. If one teacher saw it clearly, how many others saw the same thing? How many wrote letters that were never read again? How many tried to warn the future only to be forgotten by it? Somewhere right now, in a quiet archive, there are answers sitting untouched, pages filled with observations, with warnings, with truths that once mattered, and no one is looking for them, because most people do not even know they exist. The system moved on, the lessons changed, and the memory of what was removed slowly faded, but the consequences did not fade. They continued, repeating in new forms, under new names, and the only way to recognize them was to understand what came before. That is what was taken: not just information, but the ability to connect events across time, the ability to see patterns instead of isolated moments. And once that ability is gone, history stops being a guide. It becomes a story, one that can be shaped in any direction. The archive is still open, the documents are still there, and somewhere in a forgotten folder, a teacher is still trying to finish a lesson that was never meant to end, because the truth she tried to protect was never erased completely. It was only hidden, and the moment someone starts looking closely enough, it begins to surface again, which leads to a final question: if the past was carefully rewritten once, what version of the present are we being taught to believe right now?